welcome to Landline. I'm Pip Courtney. Coming up today, the amazing fight back by SPC.
I think because the Australian public could see, they could actually be powerful in this. They could influence the outcome. They could go and spend $1.20 on a can of Australian tomatoes and save some great Australian farmers and a manufacturing industry.
Also, growing vegetables with salt water.
This is a very, very special project. It's not just a first for Port Augusta, this is a first in the world.
And our comprehensive monthly weather report from the Bureau of Meteorology.
So what's the rainfall outlook for the rest of 2016? Above average rainfall is likely across much of Australia.
SPC Ardmona is an iconic Australian brand. But in early 2014, the nation's largest fruit and vegetable processor was on the brink of collapse, as its traditional markets were being swamped by a deluge of cheap imported products. Today, for the first time, Landline reveals the full story of the company's near-death experience and one of the largest community and corporate fightbacks in Australian history to save it. Tim Lee reports.
Blossom-filled trees in the Goulburn Valley mark the arrival of spring and the promise of a bumper fruit season. This time 2 years ago, this landscape was starkly different.
So once you've lost those magnificent permanent plantings, you're gone. You're going to rely on those cheap dumped imports forever. So I think the heart of Australia was broken when it happened. Literally, there was dust, there were trees being pushed over, there were fires burning beautiful fruit trees. You can't keep doing that and have a fruit manufacturing industry, you've lost your supply. So yes, it was dire, it was horrific.
The region's fruit and vegetable industry was buckling under a weight of forces. The Goulburn Valley, often called Victoria's Fruit Bowl, was fast becoming a basket case.
The flood of cheap imports, often nasty as well as cheap imports. The high dollar, Coles, Woolworths with their huge over 80% monopoly on retail, so they could squeeze the prices for the suppliers just down to an unconscionable level. So, and of course the utilities were going up, the price of water, electricity, gas, everything was going up. So you had this perfect storm.
In January 2014, the industry reached crisis point. Fruit growers such as Peter Hall pleaded for calm and federal government help.
At the time, the high dollar, the predatory practices of overseas suppliers were putting us in this crunch position. We knew it was never going to be the pattern forever. So what we were effectively saying, and to the federal government and to every other state government that was, we were looking to get assistance from, was saying, look, this is just such a short-term issue. If you don't help us now, this thing will tip over.
Australia's manufacturing industries were shutting up shop. General Motors, Holden and Ford had announced they would stop making cars here. Food manufacturer Heinz had already gone. It seemed inevitable that SPC, the nation's largest food processor and packaging company, would be next. Though the former federal Labor government had promised $25 million to assist SPC Ardmona in installing innovative, more efficient equipment at its giant Shepparton factory, the Liberal government, under Prime Minister Tony Abbott, overturned that promise. Mr Abbott said his government's policy was not to financially assist large companies such as SPC, no matter the circumstances.
In their defence, I suppose, although I'm advocating they should have, they always consistently said they weren't going to be involved in corporate handouts.
There are extremely generous redundancy provisions.
Sorry, I know the Prime Minister said this was about salaries and conditions. No, it's not. There were Families who just were in a state of total shock, not knowing what do we do now? We can't supply SPC. It is the only fruit manufacturer left. There are no other options for our fruit.
Sharman Stone, the local federal member, was so incensed she took the extraordinary step of accusing her Liberal Party Prime Minister of lying about union conditions at SPC.
Well, he's misrepresenting the facts, and so we got to the liar word.
Was that just the utter frustration of the situation? It's a big call.
Yes, total frustration, because between the two cabinet meetings in December and January, where this decision was to be taken about the investment grant for SPC, I'd made sure that all the information about the various elements of distress for SPC were in front of Cabinet, particularly in front of Tony Abbott. You know, about the anti-dumping problems, about the price of the utilities, about the dollar price, about Coles Woolworths duopoly, how it screwed down the prices of supplies. I made sure all of that was there to help inform the decision.
Sharman Stone retired from federal politics last election after 20 years as the member for Murray. This is the first time she's spoken in depth about the issue that put her at odds with her party and Prime Minister.
It wasn't a very comfortable position to be in at all, but it had to be said, and we had to take up the fight, and the fight had to be won because it was a do-or-die situation.
Fruit grower Gary Godwell, who was prominent in the campaign to save SPC, believes the company was set to close.
I believe the decision had been made that it was all over.
However, at the 11th hour, the Victorian State Government, under Premier Dennis Napthine, saved the day. It pledged $22 million in concessional loans if SPC's parent company, Coca-Cola Amatil, invested $78 million of its own.
And it wasn't until the announcement of the $22 million from the state government that Coke changed its mind. But what I think really made a change in the mind of the management of Coca-Cola Amatil was the enormous public support. That is what galvanised the whole industry, brought it together, and I'm very, very grateful for consumers' sentiment and the belief that they didn't want to lose another icon.
And so began one of the greatest corporate and community fightbacks in Australian history, the resurrection of the iconic 90-year-old company.
And because a lot of people grew up with eating SPC or Admona products as kids, there was a nostalgic connection there, and I think people were rudely shocked into the reality that perhaps these great iconic companies could not compete anymore. And I think that was both a shock and a bit of a challenge to the community.
I think it's certainly one of the bigger corporate fightbacks. We're not there yet. We've still got some fairly significant headwinds, and we could certainly benefit from more support from our big retail supermarkets in this country. But yeah, we have fought back, which is great. We're 2 years into our 3-year turnaround plan. We've invested about 2/3 of the $100 million transformation investment program, and we're making really, really good progress.
And this is part of that $100 million reinvestment. Tomatoes are a crucial part of the business, and this is what $30 million can buy. A high-tech, high-speed production line.
So it's new technology. We actually bought the technology from Italy. It was a year in the making. And if you think about, the speed that the line goes, so it's 60 tonne an hour, so it's significantly double the speed of the old line. And also it produces a superior quality fruit. We did some lab tests recently, and you can actually see the whole pieces. The chopped fruit, diced fruit looks magnificent.
The hot climate of northern Victoria is well suited to tomato production. These are a variety of Roma, only they're a little bigger, and they've got a tougher skin, which makes them ideal for processing. On a floodplain near Boort, about 200 kilometres west of Shepparton, Louis Churnside supplies SPC with tomatoes.
With the development of varieties, I mean, they develop one with good taste and good field holding capacity, and they manage the machine harvest very well.
Like other growers, he was thrilled to see the rescue package put SPC back on its feet.
SPC were under serious threat there a few years ago. It appears that they're heading in the right direction. Everything that we see looks good. You've got a new plant, and so you've got the longevity of that. That's great for the district, but I don't think anyone should be complacent about it.
For growers, that means striving to get better yields and quality and finding ways to lower the cost of production.
Tomatoes are a global commodity. I mean, they're second only to potatoes and grown in a lot of countries. We've got a great climate, great soils. The quality of what we're producing and the flavours, especially with the processed product, is exceptional. So, you know, if you've been eating imported products, give SPC and Ardmona another try.
Closer to Shepparton, his brother-in-law, John Kennedy, is also again growing tomatoes.
We grow all these tomatoes with drip irrigation. You know, it's efficient use of water, and we're getting good yields on drip irrigation. And this crop here is yielding about 125 tonne a hectare.
Like others, he's enormously relieved that SPC decided not to close.
Oh, it's a fantastic thing for the district and tomato growers, and it employs so many people, from the paddock here through to the factory and then into their marketing side too. They're doing a really good job with it, SPC.
Now John Kennedy and other growers feature on the label, part of an advertising campaign that has been hugely successful.
Advance Australia Fair.
So if you think about our My Family Can campaign, where we feature the growers, our farmers, on our tins, it's been incredibly successful. So we know that campaign reached about 4 million households, which is a phenomenal result. It also won a bronze lion at the Cannes Advertising Festival, which is the peak advertising awards in France, which is quite incredible. And our tomato sales, I'm pleased to report, are up 6% year on year, which is fantastic, really good.
I'm fourth generation in this country.
Consumers can really relate to a label with a genuine Australian family grower on the label, and then that's someone who's really cares about their product. And then it comes to the company that locally employed that really care about the whole journey of that product from that grower right through to the customer shelves and the pantry.
The public response to the plight of SPC was simply staggering. It garnered an avalanche of support via social media, on Facebook and community websites.
There were 22 million hits on that website over a month or so. It was the most phenomenal response, unbelievable. I think because the Australian public could see they could actually be powerful in this. They could influence the outcome. They could go and spend $1.20 on a can of Australian tomatoes or $1 on a can of Australian peaches and save a set of orchards, some great Australian farmers and a manufacturing industry. They could really do that.
The big retailers also responded, suddenly stocking and promoting SPC Ardmona products.
And to the community's credit, they rose to that challenge, and there was an awful lot of public media about it that was generated by support from the community, and people started to buy the products. And I think that was one of the catalysts for SPC reviving its fortunes.
SPC was fighting another critical and long-running battle, trying to stop the dumping of cheap, often highly subsidised, imported, processed tomatoes and other fruit into Australia.
We were just the target of every shonk in the South African peach market or China market with their peaches. Italy was pouring its canned tomatoes into Australia. I mean, we know, picked with virtual slave labour, the poor refugees out of the African continent, grown on soils very suspect in terms of their quality contamination issues were rife, but our anti-dumping authority at the time had not a single bone of national interest in its body.
Is that ready? That's ready.
Sharman Stone might have missed out on federal government assistance for SPC, but she did win one crucial concession from Prime Minister Tony Abbott, a more stringent anti-dumping regime in Australia. Now there are tighter controls and less cheap imports.
When we think about tomatoes, the major competitor for us is the Italian imported tomato, which is more than 70% of the market. And through the Anti-Dumping Commission, we've proven that the Italians are heavily subsidising their product. About 1/3 of the price they get back by way of farm subsidies. And that distorts the price, and so that we know that there's a lot of Italian product that's dumped in our market illegally below the cost of production, and that really has an impact on our business.
It was a very hard, bitter fight for companies like SPC to bring anti-dumping legislation to bear. It cost a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of frustration. It shouldn't be like that. Our own government should support us in doing these things, because we're really trying to keep industry here, keep primary industry viable, and keep our consumers happy with a very good, clean, green, homegrown product.
These photographs were taken by an Australian industry representative inside a cannery in a country which exports to Australia.
Public scrutiny also exposed a sinister side to some cheap imported products.
I guess they've had a light shone on their industry. So the Ethical Trading Initiative in the UK highlighted the fact that migrant slave labour in Italy is being used to pick tomatoes, and they're getting paid about 40% below the minimum award, and as little as $3 an hour for a 10 to 12 hour day, which is, unbelievable.
There has been organised crime involved in that. To me, that's a bigger story than even the anti-dumping. I find that pretty abhorrent, the whole thing with the migrant labour exploitation.
Competing with that is very difficult. Policing that is very difficult. Certainly we know in Australia we're ticking all the boxes from fair wages, environment, controls and safety, so that we know that our product is what the Australian consumers need.
And the Shepparton region needs SPC Ardmona. The revamped factory stretches for almost 1 kilometre, a mass of stainless steel and industry.
And we are the last Australian fruit processor and vegetable processor of scale, and I think that's really important. We employ more than 500 people in the Goulburn Valley, and that will swell to about 1,200 people in the peak of the season. And then there's about 2,700 downstream jobs that benefit from our position in the Goulburn Valley.
Since its near-death experience, the outlook for SPC Ardmona is now much brighter.
The dollar has moved in the right direction. The company has actually rebooted itself. It's producing different products. There's a lot more optimism around.
Obviously, water's plentiful at the moment, so that's good news. We're getting good rainfall now, just as we start to plant the seeds, which is encouraging. Our fruit intake this year will be up on previous years, which again is great for our growers and our farmers, which is good news. We look to take in about 45,000 tonne of tomatoes, so that's up on last year, which is a really good sign.
But some stiff headwinds remain.
The future's not necessarily assured. SPC Ardmona is still marginal. The growers are marginal. We're fighting in a very, very difficult industry, but we've fought for a long time. We've always been in the industry, and we continue to stay in the industry. We wouldn't do that if we believed there was no hope.
Peter Hall has replanted orchards with new fruit varieties to meet new markets. But it's a major investment, and it will take several years before he sees a return. This variety is called a Modi.
It's a red apple, sort of a bicolour. It's a very firm apple. It comes from Italy, and it's an early season apple. It comes in January, February, so we think it fits a nice slot, and it's a very nice tasting apple, very consumer friendly and good shelf life. So it's got
in 2 years here.
You'll see them in a couple of years' time. We seem to live in a world where people's memories are very transient. They live on their Facebook pages and social media pages, but they need to be continually reminded that the product that they're getting and the clean, green nature of that product comes at a cost, and people need to understand that they have to pay for that cost. It doesn't come cheaply, it doesn't come for free. It comes through the sweat of farmers and the sweat of companies prepared to back their operations, like SPC did, and consumers have got to buy into that. And if they don't, they'll have to buy products from countries that I think are far more questionable in the way they grow their food, produce their food and process their food.
We just want a fair go, we want a level playing field, and we want consumers to really embrace SPC and our wonderful, clean, green, quality products and buy more of them.
I think the great Australian public had a bit of a wake-up call and said, hey, it's hard work, it's high risk having homegrown food. We'll go out and we'll buy that product. And what I say is keep buying it, don't stop.
Without doubt, the saving of SPC is the greatest legacy of Sharman Stone's time in politics. And those fruit trees in blossom have a special significance.
It must give you some inner satisfaction that it was staved off and saved.
It does. It gives me great joy, pathetic almost, when you drive past an orchard that is replanting. Wow.
Coming up on Landline, they said it couldn't be done, but it's happening. Growing vegetables with, of all things, seawater.
You need to be an optimist. You need to think about what you have and not so much what you don't have. And I think this is a great example, right? Like, not a lot of people thought you could grow veggies in the desert, but I think you can.
After more than a year of uncertainty, the federal government has backflipped on its backpacker tax. Instead of taxing working holiday makers a third of their wage, travellers will be hit with a new 19% income tax. Farmers have called the government's handling of this issue chaotic, incomprehensible and damaging. But the coalition dismissed criticism that they were too slow to compromise.
Well, we've been working through the issues. There are a range of proposals that were put up before the budget, which in my view didn't satisfy the test that was necessary to ensure you could make the changes and not erode the integrity of the budget.
Farmers have been deeply unimpressed with both sides of politics on this issue. Labor has also refused to declare a position on backpacker tax rates, despite repeated questions throughout the long election campaign. It's still not clear what the opposition will do, but the early signs are promising for the government.
We now stand ready to support this backflip, but only if the government can show it fixes the problem.
So, is a compromise rate of 19% low enough to keep backpackers coming? Farmers think it is.
Australia has some of the highest wages in the world, so even though we tax at a higher rate, we pay much better. And overall, at 19% tax in Australia, you'll earn more here than you will in New Zealand or Canada.
Farmers now want to get that message out to make sure backpackers still front up for harvest this summer. South Australian farms have been battered by a brutal storm that cut power to the entire state. Cyclonic winds, rain and hail left trees stripped bare and grain crops destroyed. Dairy farmers couldn't milk their cows after they were left without power. And all of this has prompted energy experts to say more rural communities should consider going off the grid to avoid being hit by blackouts. The Grattan Institute has told Landline that community energy projects are one way that people in regional areas could avoid those issues.
And one of the exciting possibilities that needs to be considered would be the idea of having rural and regional Australia more supplied with renewable energy, including solar, storage and combined with diesel generators than we've seen in the past. And that actually might end up being a far more secure system than we've seen today.
There are already 20 community energy projects running across the country and plans are underway for more. In northern Victoria, one farmer is building his very own electricity plant and it's powered by pig poo. The plan is that the $75 million plant will generate enough power to run the existing intensive piggery, as well as a new greenhouse and a brand new vegetable business.
The heat coming off it now is just going up in the atmosphere. We want to capture that heat and produce methane out of it so we can use it for more and grow more energy so we can grow more food.
Once it's up and running, the power plant could process up to 200 tonnes of pig manure each day. Biosecurity Queensland is investigating a new suspected case of the devastating plant virus Panama tropical race 4. One North Queensland farm has been in strict quarantine since the fungus was found there last year. It was the same strain that wiped out the Northern Territory's banana industry in the late 1990s. Suspicious samples from a second Queensland farm are being tested now. It could be weeks before the results are known. The man known as the father of permaculture, Bill Mollison, has died. The Tasmanian scientist helped develop sustainable growing methods for agriculture, which are now taught in more than 100 different countries. Roxanne Taylor has more.
Teacher Bill Mollison and his graduate student David Holmgren coined permaculture from permanent agriculture in Tasmania in the 1970s. It's about designing sustainable and productive agricultural systems that work with nature. For example, using poultry to eat weeds and pests and provide manure.
If you design your system well and you've got your chicken systems integrated with your orchard and with your vegetable garden, you're going to get much more return from your chickens than simply eggs.
This week at the Fair Harvest Permaculture Farm in Margaret River, they've built a compost shower. It's an anaerobic compost made with wood chips from a fire control harvest, which will heat water for the outdoor shower for 8 months of the year.
The energy that the microbes are using, breaking down plant matter, creates heat. That's quite simple, and I suppose anybody that's ever stuck their hand in a pile of grass clippings knows that it's hot in the centre.
It just requires some friendly community members to lend a helping hand, or their feet.
Bill Mollison's legacy will live on in places like this around the world. He'll be remembered at the Australasian Permaculture Convergence in Perth this week.
Mollison was aged 88.
And finally, the aviation safety regulator has made it easier for farmers to use drones. As of this week, anyone can fly a small drone without a licence. On their own properties, farmers can use a drone weighing up to 25 kilograms without needing approval.
So they'll be able to use really sophisticated and large kit to do things like monitoring crops or stock, dams, fences, pipelines, all sorts of things. And certainly, there'll be more applications for farmers in the future.
They will be required to register with CASA with an ARN and let them know that they're working with drones, but they won't be required to go through the full licensing procedure as it has been in the past.
There's never been a more exciting time. That's Rural News.
A few years ago, we told you about an ambitious plan to grow fruit and vegetables undercover with just seawater and sunlight. Skeptics doubted the idea would get past the experimental phase. But next week, the company behind it, Sundrop Farms, officially opens a commercial greenhouse in South Australia, which is already producing thousands of tonnes of tomatoes for a major retailer. And as Kerry State reports, the futuristic-looking facility is set to be the first of many.
It's a vision many thought wouldn't get off the ground. But 300 kilometres north of Adelaide, the future of food production is looking very bright from every angle.
This is a very, very special project. It's not just a first for Port Augusta, this is a first in the world.
Four years ago, Landline visited Sundrop's pilot plant on the outskirts of Port Augusta, set up on unproductive country between the Flinders Ranges and the Spencer Gulf.
It consists of...
An international team of water and engineering experts had been assembled to work out the best way to grow tomatoes with just seawater and sunshine.
What we were really looking for when we built this team is people who had a passion for changing the way agriculture is done.
So when you were last here, we're about 100 in size that we're at today.
And how things have changed. That smart idea is now a spectacular commercial reality.
Since you were here last, we've grown 100-fold. We're now in the midst of our mirror field of 23,500 little mirrors, and our greenhouse is 20 hectares instead of 2,000 square meters, so quite a big change.
German-born Philipp Saumweber, a former investment banker with a background in funding international agricultural projects, runs Sundrop. He's teamed up with Dutch civil engineer Reinier Volterbeek, who has a master's in water management. So we're in this solar field. I mean, what actually happens? What do the mirrors do?
So when the sun comes up over the Flinders Ranges, these mirrors have identified that the sun is there. They basically go into an angle to receive this solar flux from the sun and point it onto the receiver at the top of the tower.
And how much energy are you actually capturing, I guess?
Peak performance during summer sits around 39 megawatt thermal.
This 127-metre high glowing centrepiece and the solar energy it captures are the keys to keeping everything running below.
If I split it roughly, half of it goes into just heating needs for the greenhouse. That's a big cost, usually. About 30 to 35% goes into making water, and then the rest is for electricity production.
A solar boiler at the top of the power tower, as it's known, produces steam, which drives a turbine to create electricity. Any unused heat is transferred to a thermal energy storage tank, the biggest in the southern hemisphere. Indeed, everything here is big. And it's a nice change for Reinier Volterbeek, who has worked in pilot greenhouses until now.
Yeah, occasionally you need to pinch yourself. It is obviously it's amazing to see that that what you think could work actually works.
Some of the original design has been tweaked. The pilot plant had curved parabolic mirrors, which looked good but were hard to clean. So when it was scaled up, the team opted for flat, everyday mirrors.
The mirrors are actually just normal bathroom mirrors. Obviously the size, I don't know how big your bathroom is, but they're 2 square meters each. But yeah, they're ordinary mirrors.
And unlike at the pilot plant, thermal oil is not being used to capture and create heat here.
When you use thermal oil, there's increased risk from a fire risk perspective. There are stories of some solar fields catching fire, which isn't great. And there's also an environmental perspective around using thermal oil. At the end of its life, it needs to be disposed of. We've completely gotten rid of that here. We now run a complete closed-loop water system.
Which brings us to the other major ingredient that keeps this operation afloat. Salt water, piped from the nearby Spencer Gulf. This is used for heating, cooling and irrigation. But before it can water crops, it needs to be converted to something more palatable. So you've got this... And that's where the stored heat in the big tank and this thermal desalination unit come in.
Seawater goes into this unit. We're extracting heat from the big heat storage tank that basically starts evaporating the seawater. That seawater vapor, if you condense that becomes fresh water.
And what goes into this other tank, this smaller tank next to it?
The waste heat from this process, which is normally dumped into the ocean, we can actually reuse for greenhouse heating. So we pump that waste heat into the second heat storage tank.
After the desalination process, the leftover salty water is cooled and diluted in a big pool before being released back into the Spencer Gulf. This is where the fresh water is kept. Now, it's undercover to keep contaminants out, but the pond holds 25 million litres. And every day, on average, 1 million comes in and about the same is pumped out and piped to the greenhouses. This is Adrian Simpkins' world. He spent more than 2 decades running tomato greenhouses in Europe and North America before joining Sundrop as head grower. And he says the desalinated water is far from second-rate.
It's almost the perfect water. So you're taking all of the salt out of it. There's no disease aspects. It's very pure, and we're able to enhance it with the nutrition that the plants require.
Okay, Kerry, so this is where a grower should spend most of his time.
As the boss in here, it's Adrian's job to keep on top of these fast-moving plants, which grow around 30 centimetres a week. And that means plenty of hours up high checking on the crop as it flowers.
So if we make mistakes up here, then we'll see it for the next 8 weeks.
So you pull these out every 12 months, but it is a perennial plant, so why do you do that?
Yeah, that's correct. The way that we push these plants, I liken it to a 100-year-old person. You're not running a marathon like you used to.
There are 4 greenhouses identical to this one. And almost 2 years after construction started, they're all producing at full capacity, with Sundrop expected to deliver at least 15,000 tonnes of tomatoes a year.
I think when you look at population growth and water shortage, we need to be able to produce food in a very efficient manner, maximise the amount of space that's available, and minimise the impact on the environment when it comes to water usage. So this project, it really is, a big step forward.
While they had to be smart when it came to sourcing water, one thing there's no shortage of, as long as enough leaves are removed to expose the crop, is light.
The more light you can give plants, the better they grow, the better they taste. So we're in a location that has about 320 sunshine days a year, which is pretty good. And from that perspective, the site has worked out really well. What we have is really hot summers, and those are sometimes challenging, but we managed to cool the greenhouses down to a temperature where the plants continue to be happy and grow well.
To cool the greenhouses, seawater is released over cardboard pads that have been installed in the walls. Fans draw hot air from outside through the wet pads, creating cooler air, which is then circulated through the growing rooms. Like many of the processes here, it's relatively simple. What's more complex is bringing all the different parts together.
I can count the number of times I've cried in my adult life on one hand, and 2 or 3 of those times have been Sundrop related. There's been countless things that have gone wrong here. We've had a roof blow off the greenhouse on a 45-degree day. We lost our entire trial crops. We lost, team members in times when it was most critical because, it took us 4 or 5 years of being in a trial facility. Not every high caliber grower wants to do that. So we've had all kinds of challenges.
Attracting workers remains a challenge. Now there are a couple of 100 jobs to fill. But the company says it's tapping into local skills, with 70% of workers coming from the region.
People did think that we couldn't find the right people for horticulture locally, but we have been able to. That being said, there is a limited skill base for high-tech greenhouse growing in Australia in general, and some of our growers, but that's really only 2 or 3 people, are from abroad. So they come from places like Holland, the United States, etc. But most of the people here are Australians and are locals.
It's a welcome jobs boost after one of the area's major employers, Port Augusta's power station, closed this year. But while the once dominant but now deserted coal-fired facility is these days overshadowed by its new solar-driven neighbour, this renewable energy project still relies on grid utilities for 10 to 15% of its power needs, especially during winter when there's less sunlight.
That's our best insurance policy. We have storage on site for about 10 days for water, for heating, cooling, electricity. But if we have a problem on site, we need to rely on the grid. As we fine-tune the system, we'll use less and less fossil power, and then rely more and more on the infrastructure you see behind me.
While the environmental savings are significant, many thought the financial costs would make this project unviable. But the boss says even though the initial infrastructure investment of around $200 million is more than what a traditional greenhouse operator would spend, it pays off down the track.
Fossil fuels can make up probably up to around 50% of their operating expenses. We bring that right down. And when you look at what we're depreciating, the cost of this asset every year, it's much lower than what they're spending every year on fossil fuels. So there's a significant saving.
To achieve that significant saving, the company first needed a significant investment to be able to expand. That came from private equity firm KKR, which is contributing $100 million. And something that helped convince the global giant to get on board the Sundrop train is the 10-year contract the grower has secured with retailer Coles.
It is unusual in the sense that it's the longest agreement we have in horticulture. It gives them security broadly about what they'll be paid, and it gives us security about the volumes that they're going to grow.
Sundrop is growing just one variety of truss tomatoes, and everything it produces goes to Coles. The retailer's head of fresh produce says what comes out of this greenhouse won't saturate the market or push smaller tomato growers out, but it will affect prices.
Tomatoes are one of our top 10 selling lines in the supermarket, and they're growing very quickly. Particularly in winter, there is a gap between supply and demand, and what Sundrop will do is fill that gap. What I would say is in winter, my personal belief is that customers have to pay too much for truss tomatoes, and what Sundrop will do will be allow us to give better value to customers, but also to provide a great return to suppliers through that period as well.
Sundrop may have a secure market, but after just a few months in operation, there is still some uncertainty surrounding this ambitious project. Namely, will the facility, which combines technology from all over the world and is designed to run for 25 years, last the distance?
If you design a new car, maybe the first 10 kilometers go fine, but does it still run after like 2,000 kilometers or 200,000 kilometers? I think, is it going to live up to its design life? That I think is obviously a question that we can only answer over time, but we're confident.
Confident enough to develop more of these sustainable greenhouses. Sundrop already has facilities opening in Portugal and the United States, and it has another one planned for Australia. While it's keeping the details under wraps for now, it says the first step for each project is to partner up with a retailer.
Once we understand what the client's requirements are, then we design the greenhouse around it. When we know what the greenhouse looks like, then we can design the sustainable infrastructure around it. So no, it won't always be a power tower, and it won't always be seawater, but it will always have a sustainable resource angle.
The water may not start out as fresh, but thanks to a lot of clear thinking, what leaves this groundbreaking greenhouse is. And a light bulb moment that some saw as laughable is now looking a lot more lucrative.
The facility behind us is already testament to the fact that life is better than it used to be at the pilot facility. We're on salaries now.
You need to be an optimist. You need to think about what you have and not so much on what you don't have. And I think this is a great example, right? Like, not a lot of people thought you could grow veggies in the desert, but I think you can. Yeah, if you think smart about it, there is a solution.
The live export trade out of the north is heading for yet another snafu. Indonesia has announced an end to permits starting next year, but from that year, that's 2017, it will insist a proportion of breeder cattle must accompany any Australian cattle headed for feedlots and then the wet markets. Now, sending a PTIC heifer to Indonesia from Australia for breeding is a very, very expensive business. By the time you have 14 days quarantine and blood tests and then feeding the heifer and the subsequent calf in Indonesia, you could add several $100s onto its base price. Australian exporters say it would be impossible to make money out of any such arrangement. These conditions have been imposed on the industry against a background of the highest ever cattle prices in Australia and a shortage of cattle, which is likely to be the case for the next 2 years or maybe even longer. And if that's not enough, there are now 6, maybe 7 live cattle export ships at anchor in ports from Broome to Townsville. Here's a shot of 3 ships sitting idle in Darwin Harbour. The demurrage costs certainly well over $1 million. Where will this end? Nobody knows. The only thing certain about Indonesia and the live trade is that everything is uncertain. There was some movement last week. A ship left for Indonesia out of Townsville and another departed Darwin at the weekend. Prices, well, with still no surety about permits for the remainder of this year, prices were firm to strong. The Indo problem looks like being a headache for some time to come. Sale-yard action remains tough for processors and lot feeders. Neither sector can be making any money, and even though numbers on offer were up last week, competition from restockers ensured prices held and indicators drifted only a fraction. Dalby, Roma and Wodonga offerings lifted and CTLX numbers went up 83%. Drier conditions helped. Market chatter has some anxiety about a decline in export volumes, with emphasis on the American market. The Eastern Young Cattle Indicator repeated last week's effort and lifted another 2 cents to close the week at 717 cents a kilo. Lamb numbers went up last week and there was a greater supply of young lambs, but still behind the average for this time of year. The market is expecting the young lambs to start taking over as we move into October, although there's some talk the abundance of feed might persuade some producers to hang on for a few more weeks. Turning now to grains, where the world is looking at the Australian wheat crop, but only for the volume of higher quality wheat that might be available. There's certainly no concern about total volume, as the world remains awash with wheat. The market remains wary too of a very large short position for wheat. This means investors are betting that prices will fall from current levels. Corn looks too to have a lot of downside as well, with some traders suggesting a slide to $3 a bushel. The Paris price of canola eased a fraction. There's weather concerns. That is too much rain in both Australia and Canada. Australian futures trading is steady to soft, with the market starting to factor in both quality and quantity downgrades. Tracking prices are also soft, with little enthusiasm for any trades. A good dry spell could sort out the market, as there is still too much water around to quantify those downgrades. Let's head now to New York for the soft commodities, where the market decided cotton is now on the B list and sugar has confirmed its place as an A-lister. Cotton trading reacted to a negative hint from China about its stockpile, plus poor export sales, and sugar has now become a market darling, with suggestions of more upside on the way. Wool had a pretty good week, recovering some of the losses from the previous week. Fine wools again did best in a market dominated, as usual, by China. The Eastern Market Indicator rose 3 cents to close at 1,290 cents a kilo. The average bale sold for $1,549. And the total auction value was in excess of $48 million. Futures wool trading saw 21 micron for December, unchanged at 1,400 cents a kilo. And that's the landline check on prices. Time now for a regular update from the Bureau of Meteorology. Here's Dr. Paul Fakemer.
Welcome to the Climate Water Outlook for October to December 2016, brought to you by Landline and the Bureau of Meteorology. This September has been the wettest on record for the Murray-Darling Basin, but drier than usual in the west. Above average rainfall and stream flows are likely to continue for the rest of 2016. First, let's look at recent conditions. Australia as a whole had its second wettest September on record. In eastern Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin broke its September rainfall record, which had stood since 1906. Some key agricultural regions have gone from El Niño dust bowls in May to lush green in September. However, heavy rainfall has also led to flooding in many parts of the country. Northern Australia had an early start to the build-up rains, with some places receiving their first 50 millimetres 2 months early. Cold seas off the Western Australian coast and cloud bands bypassing the state made less moisture available for rain. The lack of cloud and the cooler conditions resulted in one of WA's most severe frosts in a decade. The last frost of the season in WA usually occurs around the final week of September. Lower layer soil moisture is still well above average across most of Australia. Soils in the east are particularly wet, increasing the risk of floods with any further rainfall. Storages continue to rise as water flows through the landscape. Murray-Darling Basin storages rose by over 3,000 gigalitres in September and are now at their highest levels in almost 3 years. However, storages in southwest WA are still at low levels. All this rain and cloud meant September was Australia's first cooler than average month since May 2015. So what's driving Australia's climate right now? The negative Indian Ocean Dipole, or IOD, had a resurgence in September. This has brought tropical moisture southwards, boosting rainfall for Australia. Models predict the IOD will ease back to neutral by the end of spring. In the Eastern Pacific, ocean temperatures have not reached La Nina levels, but warm waters around northern Australia may lead to some La Nina-like impacts. For now, our ENSO outlook remains at La Nina watch. So what's the rainfall outlook for the rest of 2016? Above average rainfall is likely across much of Australia. Outlook accuracy is high at this time of year. The highest odds for above average rainfall are in October, so be watchful for flooding in areas with sodden soils. Keep an eye on the Bureau's website for flood forecasts and warnings. Turning now to the streamflow forecast for September to November. Medium to high streamflows are expected at most locations. Accuracy for our streamflow forecast is high at this time of year. In terms of temperatures, days and nights are likely to be cooler than usual across much of Australia. Accuracy for this outlook is high at this time of year. The bushfire outlook indicates above normal fire potential for many areas. Increased vegetation growth over winter and spring will typically dry out over summer, providing more fuel than usual, increasing fire potential later in the season. So in summary, above average rainfall is likely across much of Australia. With soils already wet and high streamflows more likely, flood risk is raised. Temperatures are likely to be cooler than usual in most places. For more details, go to our website at bom.gov.au/climate/ahead. You can also get updates via Facebook and Twitter. Our next Climate Water Outlook on Landline will be on Sunday the 30th of October. From the Bureau of Meteorology, I'm Paul Fakemer.
A few months ago, Danielle Grindlay brought you the story of the amazing tourist boom at Lake Tyrrell, a salt lake in northern Victoria. Well, it seems those tourists may have saved the town of Sea Lake.
I get phone calls from Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia.
To have all these people arrive in our town, it's like, oh, it took you that long to get here. Why did you come?
Asian people, they love pink lakes. They love pink because they're very romantic. I want to see something different. Yeah, and my friend, she loves pink stuff.
After 13 years on the market, the newsagent on the corner of the main street and the highway has sold.
We nearly sold it the first year we had it on the market, and that fell over about a fortnight from handover.
But instead of reopening as a newsagent, tourists can expect another food outlet. The roadhouse next door to a booked-out Sea Lake motel has also sold. And while Dave at the top pub struggles to keep up with visitors, the bottom pub is being renovated before its grand reopening.
I think if they hadn't started coming, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. I think we would have been closed probably 12 months ago. They're not a, say, drinking society like Australians are, but from accommodation, meals and a little bit of grog, it's helped keep me going for sure.
The supermarket is trialling extended hours and is now open on Sundays with a range of packaged meal options available to tourists. Visit the lake on any given day and you might have to trudge through soggy mud to avoid capturing dozens of others in your photo. Because yes, possibly the most important update is that farmers are celebrating glorious spring rainfall. After 2 of the driest springs on record, Western Victoria is now experiencing one of the wettest.
Next week on Landline, Prue Adams reports on the controversial campaign to rid Kangaroo Island of feral cats. And eventually, all the domestic ones as well.
Australia's third largest island is often pitched as pristine, a wildlife haven and a clean, green place to farm. Kangaroo Island has never had to deal with rabbits or foxes, and it's almost rid itself of feral goats and deer. Now, feral cats are firmly in the Isle's sights.
Ferocious and not very nice. Nothing like a domestic cat at all. If you get them in a trap, they are just absolutely feral. They just bash into the cages. They really are quite scary.
It's quite a story. So until next week, goodbye from Landline.